Hi there, folks. We're on to week two, and this week we're going to be talking about ooh, humor and irony as resistance. Sorry, I have way too many tabs open. Here we go. And you will be engaging some comic routines, some film and television, and so I'm gonna just flesh out that kind of humor and expression through the visual arts because that's really my background, but also because it has a lot to do with representation. And so, in particular, when we think about representation of Native people, there's a lot of dialogue around Edward Curtis, particularly if you're thinking about photographs, because he was a photographer who has dominated the kind of public concept of images of indigenous people. But so I used to do this kind of litmus test of just Googling Native American photography or indigenous photography and seeing who popped up, and it was like Curtis all the way through. But more recently, Native photographers, contemporary Native photographers like Makita Wilbur and Will Wilson are taking his place, which I think is a really great shift. It also just bears noting that Native people have been behind the camera as well as in front of it since the start of photography, and a great resource to give you a survey, if this is of interest to you, of early Indigenous photographers would be Sherry Farrell Rissett's Returning Fire Pointing the Cannon, Aboriginal Photography as Resistance. So we have kind of this melding of humor as a tactic and then also self-representation as a tactic. And often the two are kind of rooting together. I love this photo, Peter Patilak, and he was taking photos of his friends. And one person could read this without actually doing their research and say, oh, they're trying to avoid the camera. They don't want their photos on there. No, the real deal was that they were so excited to see Peter that they were crying and they were wiping their eyes. So um, I think images always require a little bit of digging deeper in terms of you can't just assume uh, from from the surface, right? Paul Chatt-Smith, who is a very well-known curator and scholar, makes this point really clear. He says, we, meaning Native peoples, have been using photography for our own ends as long as we've been flying, which is to say, as long as there have been cameras and airplanes. The question isn't whether we love photography, but instead why we love it so much. From the Curtis stills to our own Kodachrome slides and Polaroid prints and camcorder tapes, it's obvious we are a people who adore taking pictures and having pictures taken of us. So it should hardly be a surprise that everything about being Indian has been shaped by the camera. In this relationship, we're portrayed as victims, dupes, losers, and dummies. Lo, the poor fool posing for Curtis wearing the Cheyenne headdress, even though he's Navajo. Lo, those pathetic Indian extras in 1,000 Bad Westerns. Don't they have any pride? I don't know. Maybe they dug it. Maybe it was fun. Contrary to what most people, Indians and non-Indians alike, now believe, our true history is one of constant change, technological innovation, and intense curiosity about the world. The camera, however, was more than another tool we could adapt to our own ends. It helped us make what we are today. So, really complex things happening here in terms of Paul Chatt-Smith. He's speaking back to the kind of common way to analyze legacies of Edward Curtis are to say, that people were not aware of what he was doing, or they were victim to the power relation of a white settler person behind the camera. This is one of his first images. Uh, the elder in the headdress, sorry, in the scarf, and then the three riders on a river will be play a part in just a moment, but that's Curtis there on the far left. So he was going about things through the lens of salvage ethnography. So his goal was to document all native tribes on the continent, really, because he thought that their livelihoods were dying, that they were either being assimilated or that they were dying out. And so it's unfortunate that he was motivated by this kind of preserve and capture mentality. He was not, as Paul Chet-Smith said, always very great in terms of accuracy. He played into fantasies about what Native peoples should look like, and did put members of one tribe in the regalia or accoutrements of another tribe. So, dressed people in the wrong way, posed them in a way to um, perpetuate this fantasy and bolster his idea behind salvage ethnography. So it certainly wasn't the most fleshed out depiction, but as Paul Chatsmith said, it's unfair to just uniformly say everyone who was photographed by Curtis was a victim. There were a lot of collaborators. He, in fact, did have a Crow person study with him. Alexander Upshaw studied with Curtis, learned the camera from him and from some other people. And then Alexander became a wonderful tool for self-representation on the Crow reservation. And now the Crow Nation owns most of his archives. Another facet to think through is because Curtis was out there, a lot of people now have images of their relatives that they wouldn't have otherwise had. So it's a little bit complex. This is my favorite image to bring up because um, first of all, just Little Plume and Yellow Kidney were badasses. But here they are, they're chilling in their lodge. And there's a clock in between them, if you guys can see. I'm going to put my cursor, but I don't know if you can really see the cursor on the recording. So it's just in between them on the floor of the lodge. And this is just a really key example of how Curtis used the editing tools available to him at the time to distort narratives. And so this negative exists, but when he would print this, he would dodge and burn the background so that the clock would disappear. Um, so because he didn't want to show Little Plume and Yellow Kidney with a contemporary tool of timekeeping because it wasn't in line with his kind of fantasy of who an Indian was. So, boo on Edward Curtis, but still cool that this archival image exists and not only the edited one. So returning back to this image of the three Piegan chiefs on the river, Curtis was again kind of falling into this trap perpetuated by a lot of salvage ethnographers about, kind of the native at the end of the trail and the noble Indian, perpetuating a lot of stereotypes, the ecological Indian, and this iconography of three um, men of importance in the kind of isolated landscape became something that was repeated. So here's George Catlin, who was another ethnographer. He did not use a camera, but he was also in Piegan tribes, Blood tribe, part of Blackfoot Confederacy. You got Catlin working with the Blackfeet as well. Weird kind of repetition, particularly of Plains men within the Blackfoot Confederacy. Three guys that really gets picked on in such a clever and witty way by Jeff Thomas, who himself is Iroquois but has many Piegan or Blackfeet friends. And so he picked up another one of Curtis's prints done in the studio of three Piegan men, and then took a photo with him and some of his buddies, and then this very stereotypical statue of a native person. And you can just see the humor and the riffing and the teasing happening here. So that kind of laughter becomes really important in self-representation. Richard Throssell, um, uh, working on the Crow Reservation, his home territory. No, sorry, he was Neenah, he was Cree, but he moved to the Crow Reservation and then really got accepted by the community. Made family there, and so he was in people's houses and he just liked to photograph, to record, and so he got some great images of this middle image he titled Interior of the Best Indian Kitchen on the Crow Reservations. They were showing off their nice kitchen, and then I love the image on the far right of people just smiling and talking. Um, Uh, I just love this little puppies and kids. Who doesn't love puppies and kids and their little elk tooth dresses? But he also got into film and kind of early documentary. And the Crow Nation has been very um, active in ownership over their imagery, and so they own Throstle's film archive. And then bringing it more into current times, this is a video by the 1491s, which you will have watched or are going to watch something by them probably. And it's just called Smiling Indians. And so we're just going to watch it. Speaking back to the legacy of the very stern studio portraits and landscape portraits that Curtis kind of proliferated, and making sure to capture the humor and the joy in Native peoples. And a lot of scholars point out that that is a historical method of resistance and also just a key part of community maintenance. So Vine Deloria says one of the best ways to understand a people is to know what makes them laugh. Laughter encompasses the limits of the soul. In humor, life is redefined and accepted. Irony and satire provide much keener insights into a group's collective psyche and values than do years of research. So, Deloria makes the case that humor is really even better research than a lot of academics. And he emphasizes teasing and joking is really central to community building, particularly within Native communities. Gerald Visner, another great Native Mind talks about a comic spirit demands that we break from formula, break out of program. He talks a lot about Trickster, who's the own kind of area of study, but definitely intersects here, and how, Trickster is a way to break boundaries and also to be subversive and resist colonization. Then he also talks about irony, which is linked to his term survivance. So his term survivance is kind of a merging of survival and thriving and persistence. So it's not just surviving, it's going beyond that. But he also asks questions about, what is the purpose or function of humor? Is it coping? Is it healing? Is it resistance? Like, to what extent does it go? And then, same as Deloria, he makes good points about humor reinforcing kind of who's an insider and who's an outsider to community. Um, and then also that humor is distinct community by community. What's ironic, what's funny, what's humorous is not always universal. Sherman Alexie, who uh, is a problematic person, but is a strong figure in Native literature, says the most effective political tool out there is humor because people will listen to anything if they're laughing. So that's an interesting perspective to consider. And then Drew Hayden Taylor, who is a really funny guy, has this to say about humor. He says, Native humor comes from 500 years of colonization, of oppression, of being kept prisoners in our own country, with legalized attacks on our culture, our languages, our identities, and even our religion. Often the only way for Native people to respond to the cruel realities of fourth world existence was in humor. Humor kept us sane. It gave us power. It gave us privacy. Whenever two First Nations people come together, something magical was sure to happen. There would be laughter. Whether it was children in a residential school, or people on the trap line, or a bunch of guys working high steel, Native humor was a little bit of home tucked away when we needed it, sort of like spiritual pemmican. Um, so big praise for the function of humor in and across Native communities. And here I'm going to show some pretty humorous makers. This is Bob Jesus, well known for his kind of like bulbous figures. Um, Rosie Favell, who's from up north, she's Cree and Métis, and is re-envisioning the uh, Yellow Brick Road. Man, what's that called? With the Tin Man and Dorothy. Y'all know what I'm talking about by now, but my brain has just completely blanked. But so here's a still from that original movie where she's photoshopped herself in there with a Hudson Bay blanket. It's when Dorothy's kind of like coming back out of the dream world from where she was. And Rosie says, I woke to find my spirit had returned. And that is Louis Riel there popping through the window, a very important Métis political figure who advocated for Métis sovereignty. So riffing off of pop culture and then also subverting expectations. This is Laurie Blondeau, one of the funniest Native photographers in my opinion, especially she has some collaborations with Adrian Stimpson that I think are just hilarious. And she's even, kind of playing with some pretty derogatory terms in her title here. Um, but just the agency that play can give us. Um, this is an indigenous Peruvian person who is also kind of making a similar argument to what I was talking about with the prevalence of Curtis imagery by thinking about, if you Google Peruvian paintings, what kind of pops up and poking fun here at how we think about history and archive. This is some more of his work to kind of give context merging high, fine contemporary art in the white cube space with um, community and with artifact and history. Coming back to the US, C. Max Stevens here, riffing off of the very iconic Last Supper scene, but making a really poignant um, argument and discussion here about the prevalence of diabetes in Native communities. So if you look closely, there's um, a bunch of shoes and walkers down below, and then the table has all these very sugary, sweet things, and then the kind of eye chart off to the side says diabetes epidemic in Indian country. Um, so using kind of appropriating, and I mean that in the best way, canonical um visual art, the Last Supper is such a popular image, it's pretty much globally known. And using that as turning that into her own kind of work and making her own statement through that in a very humorous way. Another person whose play is very political is Wendy Red Star. And this is her sitting with her daughter. Her family plays a big part in her work, especially now, but this is some of her earlier work when actually she was still working on her MFA, also poking fun at the Last Supper iconography and also the kind of colonial fantasy of Thanksgiving, right? And there she is in her elk tooth dress in this completely fabricated space, colonial imaginary. And then also speaking, like Max Stevens, about food sovereignty and what has happened to people, particularly on reservations that might be food deserts that don't have access to fresh foods. Um, and something for us to think about is, what does that look like in urban spaces as well? Um, yeah, so just a lot of wit there. Um, uh, this is a work by Diego Romero, who is a potter and a printer, and this is a portrait actually of his wife, Cara Romero, who is a very funny photographer. So I'll just go back. We can see her as Superwoman, but within a traditional Cochiti Pueblo pot design. And then same kind of principle, using the photographic medium to tell a coyote story, but it's set in this contemporary space. Um, and same here for Romero's work. Again, looking at that last summer composition, but telling a story about the Indian market in Santa Fe. And if you know Indian art at all, you'd be able to recognize some people here. Like here's Chinoopa Luger. Marcus Ammerman is wearing his Buffalo Boy getup. Anyway, there's some recognizable faces there. I showed some of Tsunajane's work for last week, but this is another one of her pieces that is, you got Ronald McDonald here bridging. So actually, this is a slide that you would look at through a device that would make this look dimensional. It's kind of like a precursor to the um, Vision Master. I'm looking over on my shelf because I actually have a couple, and that might date me. You know, that was kind of a kid's toy of the 80s and early 90s. So maybe not, you're not familiar with that, but this is a very old historical process of trying to make things like more 3D. And so you'd look at them through these big, funny glasses. Um, And where Ronald McDonald is, actually, you wouldn't really be able to see when you look through. But she's also like Stevens talking about food scarcity now and the impacts of colonialism, but using, kind of humor, even though it's a heavy topic to address that. Um, Looking into a little bit of a different space. I was I was like dwelling on food sovereignty there for a second, but Edgar Heap of Birds has done a lot of public arts, um, kind of using humor and really direct wit to draw attention to uh, Native issues, particularly in terms of land claims, and a passion for him is issues with mascots. So, occupying space in billboards, but then also appropriating the kind of classic sign for, a roadmap, how many miles to whatever city, and then instead it says, how many acres or how do you quantify the land that was purchased, stolen, and then reclaimed. That was some of his earlier work, and his more recent work really appropriates kind of protest art aesthetics to make very political statements. Um, and so he is dialoguing a lot with the urban experience in terms of protest and then also in terms of presence. Um, so good person to look at. Somebody who I think is just got really great wit and really great range is David P. Bradley. So here he is, his take on the Mona Lisa, but instead it's Miss Indian World or Miss Indian USA. And another take on a really classic image, the farmer and wife. And here, so that's called American Gothic. This is American Indian Gothic, and it's actually people in their ghost dressed regalia. And so if you think about the context of American Gothic, trying to valorize uh, rural peoples who were kind of seen as the backbone of America, particularly in the wake of, the Dust Bowl and economic collapse, and life was really hard out there. Um, Here, Bradley's valorizing, these people who um, do resistance dance. Yeah, pretty powerful stuff. Ron Naganosh, he is really interesting and I think has a lot of humor, kind of dark humor in his work, because he works with repurposed media. For example, in Shield for a Modern Warrior, or Concessions to Bead and Feathers in Indian Art, there's this assemblage drum that has all these uh, flattened beer cans in the center. So, could be talking about some addiction issues, but also could just be talking about waste. Same with Marcus Ammerman, who takes hubcaps um, and reimagines them as shields and with, just kind of like junk. But Marcus Ammerman is also a very talented beater, so I had to show off some of his beadwork. And he's also the person who was in the bison outfit in the earlier image by Cara Romero. Nicholas Galinon, really rising in prominence right now, whose work is often very tactical, very cutting, speaks a lot about, what it is to be a Native person and also American citizen. So here, you saw the bear with the flag, and here are his takes on American prayer rugs, which of course look like, kind of um, frames from TV that's struggling for its signal. Um, Another person who is, I think, really clever in terms of thinking about representation, particularly within museum spaces, is Stephen Yazzie and this series of paintings called Death of the Curator, where coyotes are going through the museum. I love it. We saw a little bit of Erica Lord last week, and this is her portrait. done with light bright. Um, And this is her burden strap that shows a DNA microarray analysis of the presence of diabetes in her family. So she's really playing with, traditional materials versus like extremely contemporary materials, all to kind of speak on a very um, specific contemporary experience. Um, Dana Claxton, too, has this really interesting series called The Mustang Suite. And it's also thinking about the ways that Native peoples and territory and non-human relatives, so like the idea of the Mustang, have been used for commercial promotion. And then also thinking about histories of transportation. So it's almost kind of like an Addams Family take. We got the family portrait, we got the young boy on the horse, and then we've got the dad with the actual Mustang, and then we have some kind of feminist critique going into kind of pony shows. Um, the idea of freedom of movement and cars is also a big part in Laurie Steelink's work, particularly because she was adopted out of her Acamel Gila River communities and grew up in a family in Tucson, actually, that worked a lot with muscle cars. And so she kind of takes different parts of her history and her experience and plays with them together. Um, Someone who's really just kind of hitting the nail on the head here, though, is Haley Greenfeather English, particularly in this series of works called Super Duper Indians. This piece, especially where we've got the kind of stealth selfie stick. Um, and you might be familiar with the stereotype. I tried to gesture towards it in terms of Edward Curtis's work, but there's this stereotypical image of, kind of the lone warrior on the horse, looking a little bit downtrodden, and that is sometimes called, the end of the trail. And this is her flipping that on its head and playing with that. Um, and also kind of just playing with super bright colors and very contemporary. You've got, glitter going on this little model TP. Um, uh, so I see Haley's work as really in conversation too with my friend Bea's work. So Bea is from Guatemala, so her family has indigenous roots in Guatemala, and she talks a lot about, what ideas of the U.S. and U.S. citizenship and what these national narratives do and say. Um, so we're gonna watch one of her films really quickly. I think, okay, yeah, it's 9 minutes. Um, right. And I really want you to be thinking about Bea's making a really interesting point about um gentrification and urban presence through her indigenous Guatemalan experience, and also through her family. They live in DC and they are kind of being pushed out. But at the same time, she tells me her mom is kind of waging this war against the rats. And she's making a really compelling kind of parallel argument about the ways that we talk about um, certain groups of people at times, and also the ways we talk about animals as like, what is the appropriate place for certain groups of people, her family being immigrants themselves, and then now feeling like they are being pushed out because of certain other groups of people. And then how that also comes into a rhetoric around animal belonging in urban spaces. So let's watch.
Me llamo Edu Marroquín. Vine noviembre 18 del 1984. Emigré de Guatemala, de la ciudad de Guatemala, capital, con ambiciones de otras, no un mejor, no un mejor futuro, pero un mejor bienestar, una oportunidad de trabajo, realizar mi familia y todo lo que se refiere a una vida normal. Bueno, cuando comenzó se nos dio la oportunidad de aplicar en ciertos programas que habían, comenzamos, que nos dimos cuenta que podíamos vivir con tu mamá, ya podíamos vivir juntos y todo eso. Entonces, a tu mamá se le ocurrió la idea de que podíamos comprar un apartamento. Entonces comenzamos a aplicar con un programa que se llama HPAP, donde le dan una ayuda a uno de un 20% para hacer el pago el primer pago para poder calificar. Se dio esa oportunidad cabal en el diciembre del 94. Bueno, se llevaron como 3, 4 años para que se llevara todo el proceso, terminara todo el proceso. En diciembre del 2004, no, 94, el año de 1994, se presentó la oportunidad de que podíamos empezar a buscar un apartamento de cierta cantidad, ¿verdad? Que en este caso creo que eran solo $90,000 y nos iban a dar un 20% para poder calificar para eso, para el apartamento. Estuvimos ahí 5 años, 5 años estuvimos ahí, lo compramos y todo eso. A los 5 años se presentó la oportunidad que estas casas no se estaban vendiendo muy bien también porque el área no era muy buena. Entonces, y estaban baratas. Entonces, tu mamá me dijo, mire, vamos a ver, llamemos al número que está en la esquina porque había un rótulo ahí que pasó mucho tiempo. Entonces, nos animamos, le dije, está bueno, apliquemos a ver qué se puede hacer y llamamos a la persona encargada del programa y nos dio los papeles, la información y aplicamos y gracias a Dios nos salió. Y así fue como nos iniciamos en esta otra casa también.
Las ratas han venido a cambiar un poquito la forma de ver el vecindario, porque como hay tanta gente que se ha movido aquí, pues hay más basura. Bueno, la gente no es tan responsable como para mantener los botes de basura limpios, recoger la basura que se cae. Entonces todo eso ha venido a alterar nuestra forma de vivir o de pensar o de estar aquí o de tratar de ser algo. O sea, que las ratas son traviesas y se meten en todas partes. Pueden terminar hasta dentro de la casa sin que uno no quiera. Yo he tratado de hacer de todo. Le hemos puesto venenos, trampas, aceite de menta, lavar con cloro todos los lugares, limpiar, deshacer el jardín, porque ellas hacen túmulos abajo. Entonces es bien difícil mantenerlas fuera del lugar de uno, aunque aquí en la casa no haya comida, porque todo lo mantenemos en botes de metal. Pero de la vecindad, comen en la vecindad y vienen a dormir, creo que a la casa. Pero esa es mi relación con las ratas, no me gustan, son unos animales.
A rat problem, or do you think it's a human problem?
Las personas. Yo creo que es más de la gente que de las ratas, porque si no hubiera comida tirada, las ratas no, antes no venían. O sea, es por eso que hay mucha gente en los vecindarios ahora. Aquí en este hay tantas personas o pasan enfrente y tiran la basura. Así que a mí me toca barrer enfrente, barrer atrás para mantener un poquito limpio atrás y adelante de la casa. Pero con tanta gente es bien difícil, porque a ellos, no sé, a la gente no le importa vivir con las ratas. O sea, pues no les importa que todo esté sucio. A mí sí. A mí no me gustan las ratas porque son, sí, transmiten enfermedades y son traviesas, hacen hoyos, se meten en las casas.
Travestis o inteligentes.
Inteligentes, podría ser, sí, son bien inteligentes. Esa no les importa. Algunos olores no les gusta, como la menta, la lavanda, pero de ahí,
Hay cosas buenas aquí también. Las distancias de las cosas están todas cercanas, la transportación, los supermercados, los restaurantes y todo eso, pero tiene ciertas cosas que convienen y ciertas cosas que no convienen, ¿verdad? Este, una es, sí, hay conveniencia, pero tenemos que vivir con las ratas. Tenemos que vivir con crimen que no se sabe a qué hora le puede pasar a uno algo.
Yeah, it's so expensive. There's so many buildings, one, two, right over here, where the people were kicked out in order to have it be rentals for people who could afford higher renting prices, i.e., white people. So yeah, it's nice because you have some conveniences, but then also very bitter in that like the people of the community have been pushed out. Yeah.
sí, es como los gatos, las ratas, las cucarachas, eso siempre van a ver.
Yeah.
Sí, y así como hay perros también. Esa es otra cosa también. Ahora hay mucho perro también.
Yeah.
Y el perro, la gente no recoge el popo de los perros y eso atrae también las ratas. La gente, aunque tengan los perros, no cargan bolsa, no recogen la mierda de los perros y entonces eso también eso no es bueno para mantener limpio. No estoy contra los perros, sino contra la gente.
I think I enjoyed growing up here, but I think what would be even cooler is having the rest of my life here in some sort. So if we ever sold the house, that would be like top devastating thing that's ever happened to me in my life. Even more devastating than honestly losing Angie. Yeah, no, that would be horrible because you just can't replace this. Even with all the money, you could have, whatever, $3 million and you still couldn't replace this house because of the location. Like you really can't get any better. And if they think they can do better, they're wrong. And every place is gonna have rats. And every place is gonna have whatever. So yeah, no, that would be horrible.
Oh, Lord, good
God.
times.
Yeah, those look like being house mice.
Yeah, they were. Well, I let the mom go, having caught her.
Yeah.
Investigated a little further, and she had a family.
So I thought that was a really beautiful, thought-provoking piece by Bea. And just for a little context, Angie was their family dog. So when Bea's sister was talking about losing Angie, she was like, losing the house might be even more painful than losing their family dog. Um, just to think a little bit too, because I am asking you to analyze some literature and some film, kind of give you model by example. Um, and also kind of extend this into, how do we apply um, things from literature and film to the experience of urban indigenous peoples. Um, I have done some research following the oral tradition of a story that's sometimes about Dear Lady or Dear Woman, sometimes called Elk Lady or the Hooved Ones. And they have deep roots in oral tradition. Um, and then had this experience, this kind of resurgence in contemporary mediums like novels, but then also graphic novels um, relatively recently. And I charted that alongside, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but you'll see in just a second. I charted that alongside legislation involving murdered and missing Indigenous women, which of course now has expanded to murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, two-spirit relatives, and then also just relatives broadly, which is a phenomenon that has been going on since first contact, but has not been appropriately addressed by protective agencies. And I start with the elk-tooth dress, which you can see Wendy Red Star's in, because within many Plains communities, she's Apsaluki, she's Crow, but um, um, Blackfoot Nation as well, several Plains nations. To wear an elk-tooth dress is really to be embedded in your community because it means you have somebody who's supporting you who can fell all those elk and keep their eye teeth intact. And then you have people who can get you the trade cloth as the base of it, and you have somebody who's talented to, put that all together and tailor the dress for you. So it's really an honor to wear that. It's a connection to community. And so this kind of ungulate, hooved one, elk woman, deer woman, although is a more than human being in oral tradition, there's also a lot of visual culture references that people step into. And I kind of framed my thinking about this through Visner's concept of survivance, which I talked a little bit about prior. But here's Visner talking about it in his own words. He says, survivance is an active sense of presence, the continuance of Native stories, not a mere reaction or a survivable name. Native survivance stories are renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victimry. So very similar to what Paul Chatt-Smith was saying, talking back to these kind of flattened notions of what was going on with Edward Curtis. And what's also at play in analyzing these stories about Deer Woman and Elk Woman are unfortunately gendered um, like an intersectional experience where the misrepresentation of Native peoples is stacked on top of the misrepresentation of women. And so just to kind of give the full context, a great person to look at for thinking about that would be Philip Deloria, who is Vine's son in this book, Playing Indian. But basically, an overview of that phenomenon is that at first, in when newcomers were arriving to Turtle Island, both genders represented the New World back to settler home territories, but that pairing wasn't actually alluring enough to get people over here. And so then there was this kind of shift, aesthetic shift, and women became the sole representatives of the embodiment of the Americas in 1575. And then in particular, there were two kind of figures, the queen and the princess, who stood in for this. Um, there was a lot of conflation too between um, earthliness and then this beautiful kind of Edenistic paradise, but then also kind of frightening danger. And when people first came into contact in the Caribbean and the Brazilian islands, the bright flora and fauna kind of embodied that promise of Eden, but also the promise of potential danger. And then there was this bizarre shift where basically people decided to start readapting Greco-Roman traditions. So think of your kind of like full-bodied, marble carvings, that kind of figure to depict Native peoples. And so engravings, this was also kind of like a bizarre game of telephone where somebody who heard a story, or maybe was on a boat, maybe was on land, maybe just heard these things, would then kind of recount that to someone who had the ability to make etchings. And then those would even be engraved and printed back, on the British Isles or in Europe. So there was a lot of distortion, not only in that these were poor representations and just straight up not true and racist. But also that like it was kind of the armchair anthropologist phenomenon in visual culture. And this gave birth to these gendered stereotypes, such as the New World Indian Queen, who again symbolized this exotic world filled with riches. She was voluptuous, she was fertile, often depicted as having lots of jewelry, bare-breasted, but then also armed with spears, arrows, riding bizarre animals like an armadillo. And so she held both, the power and the danger, and then also this fecundity. She was usually surrounded by the bounty of the land, either fruits or animals, and then also had this era of kind of innocence. And then also protected by creatures or her male relatives. And so here's some depictions of that stereotype. And again, you can see like that likely a real human model was not used for reference. Instead, Greek and Roman statues were. Um, and then that kind of shifted or turned sour as Manifest Destiny took hold. And so America being embodied as a woman allowed for some really nefarious parallels of conquest and um, uh, submission, right? So you have this very disturbing engraving that was published um, in a British magazine and also in an American magazine, where America is embodied again as the bare-chested queen who is being taken advantage of in multiple facets here by some imperial officers. And then you have the flip, where in John Gast's vision of Manifest Destiny of American Progress, now America, who was once depicted as an indigenous woman, is now this she's fully turned Greco-Roman. She's this Anglo-Saxon, blonde-haired, tunicked kind of goddess figure, paving the way for righteous settlement in that kind of ideology. And so as that shifted, a second stereotype began to emerge. And there were kind of two sides to this coin. There was the princess, and then there was this more derogatory, dirty temptress side of her. And so she became less defended by warriors and more Romanesque rather than Greek. She's got the flowing gowns and sandals, and then she also has her like peace pipe and flag, and she's kind of the progenitor of Lady Liberty. But at the same time, when she loses that dangerous side and that protective side, she also becomes more sexually promiscuous and available. Other potential representations that were coming out of settler representations of Indigenous women were, and of the Americas, were this kind of motherly figure, highly domesticated, or again, the continuation of the princess as then Lady Liberty. Um, and so that's kind of the arc of this representation from protector and hostess. And then you have the cultural phenomenon of Pocahontas, the true hostess, and also the embodiment of assimilation, in that she is partnered with a Anglo-Saxon man and defends him. Um, but a lot of those, again, they're just fantasies, they're fabrications, they're not reflective of lived experience, were just that. And again, they came from these kind of wild story telephones, people who hadn't actually been on land or hadn't really interacted with people. And also, indigenous people were not really well documented in historical texts. So these representations can't be trusted for a myriad of reasons, um, that being one of them. And then at some point, following the rise and fall of the queen figure and the princess figure, then as the colonies solidify and we have the beginning of America as an independent nation, then George Washington just totally takes over for the figurehead. But the image in the story of Pocahontas endures and continues to be reproduced visually and more as a within the kind of aesthetics of um, canonized Christian art, right? You have the flowing gowns, but then you also have the very intentional way that light falls in a scene. Um, and so she really became an icon, really for assimilation and Christianization. And of course, then you have the Disney movie that added so many other elements of stereotype and out of touch with the historical reality of the situation, and that pervades as well. So basically, this is all just to say that representational histories have not done right by Native women in particular. And I won't go over this in detail, but of course, Pocahontas was a real person, and she was very young when things happened to her. And so many people see her as kind of now as an icon and as a stand-in for one of our one of the first murdered and missing Indigenous women, because she was taken out of her home community. And so that legacy of misrepresentation, that, is in partnership with a legacy of systemic and individual mistreatment, has real lived repercussions for Native women. Um, and not very much has research had gone into them for a very long time. And there were a lot of assumptions made about their role in Native society, and also a lot of power stripped from them, even though in many Indigenous communities, women are critical to all elements of society. Um, Another just to show more of Wendy Red Star's work and also hit on another cultural phenomenon. Dime Store kind of it's kind of pre-erotic novel. They were kind of like steamy love stories. Came out, and there were many that romanticized and hypersexualized Indigenous women. And this is the title of actually one that was in existence. And Wendy Red Star here uses that tactical humor to kind of revisit these and, um, subvert the extremely troubling, or just point out the extremely troubling narratives that were being promoted here, um, by just using humor. Um, and then, of course, Indigenous women um, uh, became symbols for commercial products as well, and certain qualities that were assumed out of stereotypes, like the mother figure or the princess, that they're, in tune with nature in this kind of mystical way, and maybe have this otherworldly knowledge, then made them available as icons for home remedies like this. So um, these kind of stereotypes that are enduring out of poor research and racist representations and then also just misinformation are that all natives are alike, that they were conquered because they are inferior. The core to, important to this course is that they had no civilization until Europeans brought it to them. Warlike, the carrying out of Curtis's salvage ethnography that's Native people have vanished. And then more contemporary ones, like that Native people get free rides or they're not capable of completing school. And then one that we're especially addressing right now is the stoicism and lack of sense of humor. Um, and of course, all of these are not true, but they have been repeated throughout this legacy of misrepresentation, and that has just been particularly poignant and targeted Native women. And so we are going to mention the topic of rape here, and so just heads up on that. Sarah Deer is a super strong Muskogee scholar who thinks through critically the histories that have created the phenomenon of murdered and missing Indigenous women, children, and Two-Spirit people. And a good text, if you're interested in looking into this further, would be The Beginning and End of Rape. Um, People are combating this at different levels. So Sarah Deer is like looking into the history of this phenomenon and then also lobbying for um, uh, legal repercussions and policies now. Other folks are thinking about some of the terms that go along with these stereotypes. So when Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland was in office, she banned the S word from all federal land titles because to her and to many people, it's a derogatory term. I just wanted to share that not all people feel the same way about that. An Algonquin language scholar, Marge Bruchak, says that originally that term within the Algonquin language was a respectful term meaning woman. Of course, it's been, taken out of that context now. Um, and then again, there's just self-representation and humor as methods to kind of reclaim and shift the narrative around representation, particularly representation of Native women. So, um, but the experience of MMIW endures, and here are some statistics about it if you're unfamiliar. I won't belabor it. Um, just to say that this is not a new phenomenon, and we can look even into our the visual culture of Native peoples to see that this is not a new phenomenon. For example, this is a ledger plate from Walter Bone Shirt showing a Native woman on exile from her community, and she is armless. And researchers and relatives of Bone Shirt emphasize that this is because she has been stripped of her agency, and that could have played out in many different ways. And it is a violence, whether or not it was a physical violence and a physical loss of her arms. Um, and so uh, here is this very compressed timeline of MMIW becoming recognized and entering dialogues in the federal governments of Canada and the US and lobbying for legislation and investigation into how to prevent this, how to respond to this. And there's kind of a lead up and then an endurance through this timeline that intersects with this real boom of this oral story about Dear Woman, about a woman who is also a deer and can transform one way or the other. And the way that I've heard and the way that I've read that those stories that exist in many different tribal nations, the Deer Woman is often about restoring balance, and sometimes she's punishing people who have stepped out of line. Often, they're not doing right by their relations, and she can even do protective work to prevent further harm or to rectify harm. And so there's a very powerful, a gentle, um, indigenous woman and female being, more than human being, that kind of traverses across the continent, which I think is interesting because deer exist all across North America, so they've been visiting. And so in my research, I look at a couple of different uh, contemporary adaptations of that speak to contemporary experiences of feeling out of balance and feeling disconnected. One of them is in Stephen Graham Jones's The Only Good Indians, but the two that I really wanted to talk about here, just so you could see kind of how that gets applied. So when you're doing your assignments, you have a little bit of a model is uh, I looked at Elizabeth Lepence's edited anthology called Dear Woman, which is a graphic novel collection of stories about Dear Woman. Some of them are very traditional and some of them are contemporary adaptations. And one that really stood out to me was actually Lepence's own story of modeled after her own experiences of sexual assault. And at the end, she transforms into her own version of Dear Woman. And the final panel says, and in the end, whatever we have experienced, we always return to ourselves. So it's very affirming of her power and the power that she's always had and her ancestral power. Um, and a really potent analysis of the art that accompanies this story done by Jonathan Thunder. Uh, Claims that by re-embodying the Dear Woman, um, this is a rearming of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit queer peoples, not only through practices of remembering Dear Woman stories, but also through physically and metaphorically remembering these kind of fractured bodies and histories and activating traditional arts practices through resurgent regenerative networks centering contemporary Indigenous women. Um, Using this really accessible, pretty contemporary medium of comics, these artists are able to reactivate Dear Woman from her traditional places in native oral stories, and her encoded visual representations in petroglyphs, winter counts, birch bark scrolls, and animal hides to envision contemporary Dear Women healing from ongoing legacies of sexual violence in contemporary settings and apply that to their own experience and kind of talk in circle and share about that experience for their own individual community or their own individual self and the endurance of that ability to dismantle that settler violence as told in oral tradition and as embodied individually. And so here are some other examples. There was a pretty traditional Dear Woman telling that was actually done by a mother and daughter featured in the comic, which I thought was great. And then the anthology ends with all these drawings from youth community members, kind of reflecting on what makes them feel powerful, topics that were important to them. So they're not all necessarily directly focused on Dear Woman, but they were about kind of empowerment. And if anyone has watched Reservation Dogs or is going to watch it, spoiler alert, there is a great episode about Dear Woman doing this protective work. She's going out and uh, bringing bad guys back into balance. Um, and one of the characters meets her when he's young and he's very nervous that she's going to get him at some point. And she comes to him kind of like an auntie and says, as long as you do good, you won't see me again. As in, I'm not going to come and trample you to death is how the mini oral stories end. And so looking at the presence of Dear Woman and the work that those stories do in traditional settings and also in contemporary settings. Kimberly Dawn Robertson talks about the Auntie Alliance, which is a very real phenomenon in the world we live in. The stronger your Tia network, your Auntie network is, the better your chances at survival are. And she thinks about that as the power of the herd, the power of survival, resistance, and love. So basically, it's community and it's having strong women in community. That allow people to remember their stories and remember their power. Um, and kind of applying this out, Joshua T. Anderson, as he was analyzing Dear Woman, he says the comics in that anthology work to reveal how Indigenous women's bodies and sexuality sovereignties are directly linked to Indigenous futurities and the right to reclaim and protect Indigenous territories. All are interwoven. So, linking the exploitation of Indigenous lands to the sexual exploitation of Native women and girls, as we saw in Legacies of Visual Culture, both the comic and the activist organization call for an intersectional approach to violence across gendered, generational, and geopolitical lines. So, even though it's something kind of as low production value as a community comic, that has great power. And what Dear Woman, the comic, argues is that, to have that community and to have that knowledge is a really strong protective element. And so that's something that we see again and again in urban communities is that real emphasis on community. Um, so that's how we're kind of all tying it in. And that's just an example of looking at creative media and applying some analysis that thinks about uh, uh, histories of Indigenous storytelling and then also applying them to lived realities. I always try to end on these resources when I talk about topics like that, but I am just going to go back here to say that when we look at the statistics for MMIW, it's urban centers that are being having data collected, but it's not urban center exclusive. In particular, there are a couple areas I can think of one highway in particular in British Columbia that are notorious for being sites of disappearance. But the cities definitely have a big role to play. So as you're thinking about that and reflecting about that, um, going into our next week, we're going to be reading some articles that emphasize the critical role of women in keeping communities together and especially just like keeping the community centers running. So I want you to hold this information in mind when you're thinking about that importance next week. All right, that's it for this week. Thank you.